Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. A few months ago, we had my Berkeley friend, Adam Hochschild, on the show. Adam's one of America's leading historians. Has a relatively new book out last year, American Midnight, The Great War, A Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis. Adam's not only a good historian, but a good futurist, and he saw in this period during the First World War the seeds of much of what's happening in the 2020s in America. And today I have the honor of having another of America's leading writers, Stephen Johnson. He's known both as a historian and a futurist. I think the best historians are futurists and the best futurists are historians. He has a new book out, The Infernal Machine, on the period just before and during the First World War. The subtitle of the book is A True Story of Dynamite, Terror, and the Rise of the Modern Detective. Stephen is joining us. Appropriately enough, Stephen, from Google, the digital heart of detectivism in the world today.
Yes, indeed.
You know everything, Stephen, right? There, wherever you are in the Google.
Sadly, I do not. I am just a tiny little cog in the machine here, but yeah, I am technically at the Google headquarters here right now.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Adam's new book, American Midnight. Your new book, The Infernal Machine, focuses on the same period. They're different kinds of book, different kinds of subject. But what is it about this period at the turn of the 20th century that makes it so interesting historically and relevant in the 2020s in America?
Yeah, I mean, it's a period of very intense, I mean, compared to recent American history, actually much more intense political violence and political polarization in a way. Whether we are on the cusp of another period like that is one of the reasons why it's interesting to go back and revisit this stretch. Interestingly, I had initially gotten into this really on the kind of the police work side of it, that I was interested in. You know, in general, in all of my books, while they cover a lot of different topics, there's always this recurring theme of kind of the roots of innovation and new technologies or new scientific ideas and how they come into being. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to write about the birth of forensic sciences and the transformation of police departments from basically just kind of mob enforcement agencies to actual investigative units that used latest technologies and information science to solve crimes. And I kind of wanted to write a book about New York. I'd actually written way more about London, bizarrely, as an American, than I'd actually written about New York, where I'd lived most of my adult life. And so I got interested in that period because that's when the NYPD really kind of modernizes. And so I did some initial work into that, but it felt a little too small. Like it felt almost like too much of just a straight true crime kind of book. And I started to notice in the research just how many of the newspaper articles that I was going through in the archives had stories of dynamite bombs going off, many of them acts of political terrorism, just day after day in New York City in that period. And I started to figure out like a little bit more about how that had come about, and all of a sudden I realized I had a book.
When I was looking at your book, one of my favorite novels from this period is Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent, which is a book about this period and the violence of the time, the anarchists. Conrad presents, in my view at least, the anarchists of the time as rather absurd, not particularly dangerous characters. Do you think that's right? Or were they the equivalent of the Al-Qaedas of the 21st century?
I maybe would put them somewhere else on the map. I mean, it's a great question. I remember reading the Secret Agent in grad school, and the thing it's based on this famous factual event where someone accidentally, I believe, blows himself up by the Greenwich Observatory. And there's kind of a moment where I can't remember whether Conrad does this or it was somehow came out of the context of reading it, but it was like this experience of people just being absolutely blown to bits was kind of a novel thing. That it was, people had been dying in violent ways for all of human history, but like because of dynamite, you would just have these explosions in the middle of a city where suddenly like people were just, atomized practically in the blast. And somehow that like stuck in the back of my mind. It's great that you bring it up, because it was like the distant kind of seed of the idea that became part of Infernal Machine. But I tried to, so anarchism as a movement just it really doesn't map to the current political landscape at all. One thing that it's important for folks to understand is they were both opposed to kind of big capital and big corporations and opposed to big government. That fundamentally it was a movement that believed that the kind of the apex of human society had been the kind of Renaissance free cities, kind of guild-driven, artisanal, smaller communities, much more egalitarian, kind of the Italian hell towns and that kind of model of life. And when these ideas were emerging in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, it was right at the dawn of industrialization, and a whole mass of humanity was being shuttled off into factories and suffering violent accidents, every day. Life had been reinvented in just a generation or two. And they looked at that and said, this is madness. This is crazy. Why are we doing this? This is not the way human beings are meant to live. We had a better balance. We should kind of return to that. And there's part of that vision that is kind of forever lost to us now, because society has fully transitioned into a post-industrial age and we can't get back to it. But one of the things that I was trying to do in the book, so that the anarchists weren't just kind of flat villains that just seemed like insane people, or just embodied evil or something like that, is to try and reconstruct at least why that philosophy was at least tenable, like as a viable position to take. And then, which is really best embodied in this guy Peter Kropotkin, the Russian kind of founder of anarchism, who is a fascinating 19th century figure, evolutionary theorist, pioneering geographer and geologist, and anarchist philosopher. I mean, just an amazing story. And his view, that kind of return to the free cities view, I think is presented somewhat sympathetically in the book. The problem is that they got bound up in this strategy, and in fact really invented the strategy of terrorism. And that is kind of the tragic fall that they go through, that the book documents.
So let's go back to the New York of the period. I think Adam is probably slightly more sympathetic to some of the more radical movements than you, although you're not necessarily unsympathetic. What about the social conditions? You mentioned Russia, of course, where the social conditions were much direr, much more suited to the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. But the New York of the early part of the 20th century was a pretty brutal place, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of a key section when, the two main anarchists at the center of the book, Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman, emigrate from Russia and arrive in the Lower East Side. And there's some kind of description of the Lower East Side. I can't remember what the exact numbers are, but the population density of low-rise Lower East Side is something like 5 times what current high-rise Manhattan is. So you had 5 times the number of people per square feet, like crammed into 4-story tenement buildings, and a whole infrastructure of modern city living. I mean, this is the same thing I wrote about in my book Ghost Map about London during that period, when cities in the 19th century just went through these periods of unbelievable, really unprecedented growth. They just couldn't handle the number of human beings sharing space in that, and that we hadn't developed the technologies of waste management and recycling and all the different things that indoor plumbing and all the things that make it possible to live in a big city. And so it was a pretty, parts of it were a pretty dire place to be. Yeah.
And what about, you've mentioned anarchism. What about the socialists? How do Goldman and Berkman, as you note, the central characters in your book, they come up in lots of studies of this period. How do they relate to the other radical movements? Were they both hostile to organized socialism?
I mean, there's a lot of overlap. The IWW Wobblies and that world. There's a lot of crossover. The big debate, obviously, that ran through the left at that point. A lot of it came around the role of the state, right? Should there be some kind of large state apparatus that is in charge of things, which becomes obviously what ends up happening in Soviet Russia. And at the end of the book, not to give too much away, but Berkman and Goldman end up going to Soviet Russia and end up being famously kind of disappointed by it because of the state apparatus. But there was a lot of crossover and a sense of, just the general support for the labor movement, and for things like, there was unanimous kind of alliances around the ideas of reducing the number of hours of work, and wrestling with the fact that there was just tremendous physical peril that one faced working in factories during that period. So there were a lot of shared themes, but I think there was not necessarily on the side of the socialist left or the communist left the same sense that we needed to eradicate the government as dramatically as we needed to eradicate capitalism.
Stephen, last year I also had Paul Moses on the show, another historian of the period. His book, The Italian Squad, The True Story of the Immigrant Cops Who Fought the Rise of the Mafia, features a man called Giuseppe Petrosini, a New York detective who was actually assassinated in Sicily. Tell us about the nature of the New York police at this time. You talk in the book about the rise of the modern detective. What was the pre-modern detective like?
I mean, on some level, he didn't exist, or she didn't exist. There was a detective bureau starting in the 1880s, but the idea of a police officer that was using information science or forensic science to solve a crime, rather than rough up a suspect in an interrogation room was largely unimaginable for most of the 19th century, right? You had the police as mostly enforcers of kind of Tammany Hall, New York. You had a few interesting developments. I mean, the main figure that I profile in the book is this guy, Joseph Farreau, who joins the force at the end of the 19th century and becomes interested in these new scientific developments, scientific policing, that were being developed in Europe, largely through Alphonse Bertillon in Paris and Scotland Yard in England. And he goes over in kind of 1904, 1905 period and basically gets a training course. He does a kind of like personal development session by going to Europe and learning about all the sciences of portrait parley, of measuring people's body parts and taking photographs and then fingerprints. And he brings it back to New York, and it's seen as literally the police commissioner is like, it's a fad, and a London fad at that. And so it's kind of greeted with derision and not taken seriously. But he kind of does a couple of clever things to prove the efficacy of this technique, and it ends up they let him create this little identification bureau where he starts taking fingerprints, and he refines they had a rogues gallery where they were doing work with photographs, but it just wasn't very well indexed or organized. And so that was the beginning of the transformation that really, is at the center of Infernal Machine.
Yeah, it's interesting just thinking out loud. We've done shows on Poirot, Agatha Christie's great modern detective creation. She takes him for granted, but we shouldn't historically, because Poirot is himself, and men like Poirot, fictional or otherwise, are modern creations. What about the state itself? I know you note in the book there was a famous incident, particularly in retrospect, when a certain J. Edgar Hoover, young man hired after the riots of 1919, meets Emma Goldman, throws her out of the country. I've never got Beverly Gage on the show, but I do want to get her book G-Man. J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century focuses on the emergence of this surveillance state. Is this one of the key themes in your narrative, Stephen? The emergence of a state, as you said, there were no detectives before really the beginning of the 20th century, and there wasn't much of a state, certainly a surveillance one, was there?
Yeah, particularly in the United States, it had always had this tradition of resisting the idea of a federal investigative force. It was seen as kind of anti-American, and the Europeans were much more, I mean, you had something like Interpol, you had an international investigative body, which by the way was founded in 1898 directly as a response to the anarchist threat. So the in a sense, the macro story of this book is how this political movement intent on eradicating centralized state and corporate power ends up triggering into kind of unleashing this apparatus of state surveillance that is it's worst nightmare. I mean, the antithesis of everything he was trying to do. So the anarchists kind of prod this infrastructure into being, and there's so many things that we take for granted, as you said, that just weren't around. I mean, basic mechanisms of identification, right? There was no, whether you're a criminal or not, there was no real way to formally prove who you were. So if people would get arrested, they would just make up a name and say,
those were the days. You didn't even need a pass. Isn't that the famous, I don't know, it was H.G. Wells or someone, you probably know who said this, that boasted that you could travel from London to China without a passport?
Yeah, it was an interesting time, and we now take it for granted that every step of the way you have to show your papers. But that is an invention of the last century and a few decades. So part of this story is that these new ideas, I mean, it's literally called the Identification Bureau in the NYPD, that these ideas that are being imported from Europe and then kind of incubated in New York, because New York is going through this really insane wave of political violence. There's something like 7,000 bombings in New York between 1895 and 1920, many of them political in nature. And so New York kind of builds this apparatus to combat these crimes using all these information sciences and stuff like that. And then basically that graduates up one level to the federal government. And the first practitioner of this new science is a young J. Edgar Hoover, who crucially, and this is, kind of part of his lore, but I think it's a really important part of the story of Hoover's life, is that he worked at the Library of Congress as a teenager and in college, and there had been a new kind of indexing system that had been brought to the library by this guy Putnam, who'd run it, and it was a system for basically indexing and cross-referencing and making information more accessible. And Hoover took that idea that it made such an impression on him as a young man, and decided to apply that to fighting crime. And so it really was this period where he kind of weaponized library science in the name of subduing subversive threats in the United States. And as you said, the very first people that he basically took this new power and targeted at was Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman.
And of course, he went on to found and certainly run the FBI for
50 years.
50 years, quite an accomplishment.
Yeah.
Given all this violence, I mean, Adam is on the left politically, unambiguously, and I think he sees a lot of what happened, the Palmer raids and J. Edgar Hoover's involvement, as being profoundly unjust. But in your narrative, given that you stress the amount of violence, was the response of the state in some ways justified or unavoidable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the way that I would put it is I kind of raised this hypothetical at the end, that the question I have is, was there another path for the anarchist movement that did not embrace terrorism? The defense of the terrorism is effectively, which I try to give weight to in the book, is effectively a kind of they started it argument, which is to say, and this is factually true, there was far more people were mutilated or killed in, on the factory floor and industrial workspaces, from 1870 to 1920 than were injured in terrorist attacks from the anarchists or the radical left. That everywhere industrialization took root initially, you would see these incredible increases in workplace mortality and injury rates and life expectancy declines and things like that. And so, the infernal machine is technically what the press called the bombs. That's where the title comes from. But from the anarchist point of view, the infernal machine was the steam engine, right? That was the thing that had brought such destructive carnage to everyday life. And to respond to that with to counter violence with violence, to counter the guns of the state and of the capitalists with dynamite, seemed like a reasonable response to them. I think with hindsight, I personally believe that political violence is not a good strategy and an unethical strategy, but one can imagine being in that situation and perhaps coming to that conclusion. To me, the question is, this is the period where Gandhi is developing nonviolent protest as a strategy, incredibly successfully. And so was there a path where, someone like Goldman, who always went back and forth, and I talk about this a lot in the book, on the question of violence and the utility of violence, ultimately claimed to be opposed to violence, but could never quite bring herself to renounce it when it was done, even when it was done in her name, as in the assassination of President McKinley. If people like Goldman had truly taken the nonviolent path, would it have allowed that philosophy to survive longer, to be viable for a longer period of time, to not trigger this reaction from the state and trigger these mass deportations? Maybe it would have been more of a part of the conversation. And to me, the crazy thought experiment is to imagine an alternate 20th century where Kropotkin is the patron saint of the left instead of Marx, and the kind of counter to state capitalism on the table is not state communism, but rather this smaller scale, slower, less technologically driven, more human scale alternate way of living. And that would have been I don't know whether that was a possible scenario, but it would have been a very different scenario had the anarchists made their case more successfully. And perhaps they would have been able to make it had they not resorted to the bombs.
It's what in Silicon Valley people call left libertarianism. When I look at Emma Goldman, I think, of course, of Rosa Luxemburg. They have similar looks, similar physiques, similar energy, similar relevance. This was a period, of course, where Luxemburg was murdered on the streets of Berlin by fascist thugs. What about the violence outside the state? The violence that got unleashed by men like J. Edgar Hoover, but it wasn't done under the aegis of the state. It was done by thugs, racist thugs, anti-Semitic thugs, often anti-Catholic thugs. Of course, the role of the KKK was also particularly important in this period.
Yeah, it's a great point. Well, I think that is one of the reasons why I think it's very interesting to just revisit. I don't talk about the KKK or any of those other kinds of movements just because there's already so much to cover in this book. But I think that it is a useful corrective to the assumption that we sometimes hear today that we live in particularly tumultuous political times right now. And well, obviously January 6th was a distinct moment in our history that does not have a lot of precedent. Up until that point, this period of the last 20 or 30 years, compared to almost any other phase in the 20th century, has been a period of relatively limited political violence from the left and from the right and from the state. If you look at things like assassinations, there was one of the reasons there's a long sequence about the assassination of Alexander II, which is crucial in the story of Berkman and Goldman, and also the story of terrorism, because it's the first suicide bomber in history. But that period, all the way to the 70s, so about 90 years, there's just this off the charts. it becomes far more dangerous to be a head of state during that period. And so, and I was born in 68. So, we all know what happened that year in terms of assassinations. And so there just was, between riots, between, corporate-backed militias shooting down strikers, to political assassinations, to terrorist bombings. It just was a much more volatile period back then. And I think most people would agree the 60s were more volatile, the 70s were more volatile. And so that has actually been more the norm. And we have lived through a period of relative tranquility for the last 20 to 30 years. But you don't, for some reason, that offends people. I don't know. Like, people like to think that they live in unusually turbulent times. But I think it's sometimes helpful to remind ourselves that it could be much worse.
You use the T word, Stephen, terrorism. I don't know the genealogy of, or the etymological origins of the word when it became popular. But of course, America was always a place of enormous violence. I mean, the assassination of Lincoln, some people could argue, was carried out by a terrorist. What distinguishes that act of terror from the kinds of things that Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman got up to in the 19-teens?
Yeah, I think one change, and again, it's interesting. There was just a review of the book in the Times, in the New York Times, and by Clyde Haberman.
Yeah, it was a nice review.
Yeah, it was good. It was lovely. Yeah, there you go. And he has a line in it I thought was really striking near the end, where he says the real protagonist of this book is dynamite.
Yeah, I was going to get to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that on some level, you obviously you had assassinations before that, and I think it does shift a little bit from a longstanding tradition of political assassinations towards, okay, we're going to target captains of industry like Henry Clay Frick, who Berkman attempts to assassinate in 1892. Allegedly, this bombing that happens in 1914, that's very central to the book, was originally intended to target John Rockefeller Jr. So there's a little bit of a shift to, we're going to assassinate the captains of industry. But what makes, I think, the kind of modern definition of terrorism more applicable is the idea of using, these kind of spectacular displays of violence that, in some cases are targeting civilians, but are also just targeting physical infrastructure. So there's an attempted bombing of St. Patrick's Cathedral that is central to the plot of the book. And bringing
the system down, right?
Yeah. And what's crucial to this is dynamite, right? Because you could do these, like, you dynamite gave you this asymmetric power where you could be this very small, you could be a lone individual, you could be a small band of people. And because you had this genuinely new explosive power that had not existed until right at the moment when anarchism came into the world as a political philosophy, it gave power to the powerless, on some level, like literally the physical energy definition of power. And that, I think, set a template for modern terrorism, where the goal was, not just to eliminate this particular figure so that perhaps there would be a change in power, but rather to create these, in a sense, media events, really. I mean, a part of this is that it's both happening in a world where you have dynamite now for the first time, and news of the bomb that you detonate in New York will reach, around the world in a matter of days for the first time. And so I think that's the sense in which, I mean, it's not really called terrorism in that period, but that is, that's the part of it that is recognizably kind of modern terrorism, I would argue.
I want to take a short break, Steve, and then I want to come back and talk about the technology of dynamite. But I want to remind everyone that wonderful guests like Stephen Johnson are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, edited by Leon Wieseltier, wonderful editor historically of American culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Stephen Johnson to blow up the whole world to talk about dynamite. So don't go away, anyone.
the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with a prolific writer. How many books are there now, Stephen? About
this is number 14.
Number 14. I remember talking, you remember Clay Shirky?
Yeah, of course.
And I remember him saying to me sometime a few years ago, he said, one day I'm going to grow up and be like Stephen Johnson and be a real author. You're one of the few left, and he has a major new book out. All his books tend to be bestsellers. This one, I think, is inevitably going to be enormously successful. The Infernal Machine, a true story of dynamite, terror, and the rise of the modern detective. It already got a very nice review in the New York Times by Clyde Haberman. And as Stephen said in the first half, Clyde argued that the real star of this book was dynamite. And of course, Stephen is a historian in many ways of technology. The father, we all know, of course, of dynamite is a certain Alfred Nobel, the father of the Peace Prize. Any ironies here, Stephen?
Tragic ironies, in a way. Yeah, Nobel's story is so interesting, and I actually, when I was kind of diving into it, I had a couple of moments where I thought maybe there's just a book about Nobel that I should write, but I kind of can't. I don't know. I'm not a good normal biographer. I don't have the discipline for that, I suppose. But basically, Nobel. So the underlying explosive force that is generated in dynamite is nitroglycerin, and nitroglycerin had been discovered by this scientist Sobrero in about 1845 or something like that, and pretty much anyone who messed with nitroglycerin in that period gave it up pretty quickly if they were still alive, is basically the story. Like, if they still had fingers left and were still alive, they decided this thing is too dangerous to work with. And it was really the first major advance in the kind of capabilities and force of explosions since the invention of gunpowder. I mean, gunpowder had been slightly refined over the years, and you figure out ways to pack it more effectively and make it more efficient. But generally, nitroglycerin was the first, significant leap forward in about 1,000 years. But it was, notoriously unstable. You could shake a canister of it and it would blow up in your face. And so Nobel got this idea as a young man that if you can contain that force, and the opening chapter of the book is called The Controlled Explosion. If you could figure out a way to manage it and domesticate it, in a sense, you would have this extraordinary tool, not for military uses, and certainly not in Nobel's mind for political terrorism, but rather for civil engineering, right? That you could use what he would eventually come to call dynamite to power your way through, making railroad tunnels and making the Transcontinental Railroad and building the Panama Canal and many other major industrial achievements of that period. And so he got obsessed with it, and so obsessed actually that while his younger brother died, was blown to bits in a explosion in a lab that Nobel himself had built on their family compound in St. Petersburg. Most budding entrepreneurs at that point would presumably say, hey, I maybe should do another project. Nobel stuck with it and continued to refine this nascent technology until he managed to basically create, using this kind of porous sand that he found near his factory in Germany. He figured out if you mix that with the nitroglycerin, it was much more stable, and you could kind of sculpt it into these different shapes that made it interesting for creating the classic kind of dynamite canister and other forms. And it ended up working, and he was hugely successful. But it's one of those stories that I've been writing about increasingly, about technology's unintended consequences, right? He succeeds in doing what he was trying to do with this technology. It rewards him immensely, but it turns out that it also unlocks this door of possibility for a completely different use, which is blowing up people in a cafeteria or assassinating a Russian czar. And that leads to this kind of wave of violence that Nobel is kind of intimately associated with in the press. He's known as the Merchant of Death. And so he ultimately creates the Peace
Peace
Prize
Prize.
as in a sense, as kind of an atonement. I mean, with the other prizes as well, but that was the most original prize. No one had ever thought about making a prize in the service of peace. And he had thought that dynamite would actually itself be an agent of peace. He had a kind of like mutually assured destruction theory of it, that once people saw the destructive force, they would put down their arms, which was very naive. But I think he was genuinely kind of disturbed by what he had unleashed on the world. And so the Peace Prize is his gesture.
Yeah, as
from
another
the grave.
famous inventor in the middle of the 19th century said, when he revolutionized the technology of communications, what has God wrought? If we had someone from the NRA on the show, Stephen, they might argue, I don't want to put words into their mouth, but they might argue it's not gunpowder that kills, it's not dynamite that kills people, it's people. What's the difference then between gunpowder and the gun? I mean, that was also an instrument of enormous violence that sort of that entered certainly the modern gun that entered stage of history in the American Civil War. Is there something in technological terms different between dynamite and the gun?
I don't think so. I mean, they just have a different, they create a different kind of carnage, which then creates a different kind of potential for acts like terrorism, where you want that, spectacular explosion is more valuable, almost in the kind of like media event of it all. But I think that, the other point you're kind of alluding to, which I think is right, is, there's a limit to which one can blame Nobel here. I think there was an inevitability that dynamite with another name would have been invented. There was too much of a need for this kind of explosive force because of what was happening with railroads, because of what was happening with building skyscrapers, because of what was happening with building the Brooklyn Bridge and the Panama Canal. There was just an incredible need for it. And given that nitroglycerin had been discovered, it was probably, I think inevitable that someone would have come around to this, some variation of this combination of materials that made dynamite possible. So Nobel, is to blame on some level for what dynamite wrought in the world of political violence. But I think it was probably going to happen one way or the other.
Let's fast forward, Stephen. You've been very generous with your time. Let's fast forward to the 2020s. Over the last 100 years, in the period from the 1920s, when your story ends, have we seen the architecture of this surveillance state? Some people talk about a digital surveillance capitalism, the emergence of technologies that allow people to be watched when they're working, hospitals, the realization of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, which of course was an 18th century idea. Is the modern detective and the rise of the modern detective over the last 100 years, has it gone hand in hand with the rise of the modern detective state, in your view?
Well, I mean, empirically, there's no question that there is, far more information captured about all of us, including biometric information, than, compared to any citizen of the world in 1890 or even 1924. I mean, there is just an absolute increase for, that is uncontested. That and the emergence of, what Hoover introduced was, a card catalog system. I mean, he literally had a system of index cards, and he figured out a way to cross-reference them. And you compare that now to, there was a project that was very controversial after 9/11 that never really got built, but I think the slogan of it was emblematic, which is Poindexter's thing, which was called total information awareness. And I think that's, for better and for worse, we live in a total information awareness society. I thought it was very striking, when Goldman and Berkman, the first time that their the Goldman they're sent to prison at various different times, but right before they're ultimately deported, they're arrested together under the Espionage Act, which had been created, and this is in American Midnight too. They've been created to enforce kind of patriotic support for the American entry in World War I. And that act was the very same act that was basically the kind of was used against Edward Snowden in his leaks about the NSA. And so there's some kind of fitting symmetry to that. If you compare the extent of something like the NSA's operations to those card catalogs that Hoover had created, it is no question that it is increased, and it's increased. I'm coming to you from Google. It's obviously increased on the level of private companies as well. I think the question is, do the benefits and the security and the convenience of that information outweigh the costs? And that's that's something that I wouldn't speculate on, but to simply say that it has increased dramatically.
Why wouldn't you? I mean, isn't that the heart of the book and your thinking and the relevance of the book of I draw the line on this stuff?
Yeah, I do think on the side of, for sure, on the side of the surveillance state that there was something regrettable about it. I think it was inevitable that there was going to be more information management. I don't think it would be possible to live in a modern society without having, something like a driver's license and a passport, as lovely as it would be to live in that world. But I'm not sure if we need the NSA. And
finally, Stephen, you're a tech guy. You work at Google. You're based at least part of the year in the Bay Area and then in New York, which is also a tech place. Is Web3 the answer to all this? Decentralized networks?
It's a great question. We should do a whole other conversation.
Maybe that's your next book.
I wrote a very long piece for the Times Magazine about 6 years ago about Bitcoin and Ethereum and the blockchain. And I tried very hard to convey the argument that was being made that it was not just about currency, it was not just about speculation, but it was actually about creating a foundation for a new kind of open architecture that would allow more open standards like the original ones that had founded the internet and things like email. And I was very sympathetic to that idea, but I have grown, I guess I would say, a little bit jaded in the sense that it has been 6 years now, and I haven't seen anything really built that is useful to people in an everyday kind of context. There's been a lot of speculation and a lot of trading and a lot of hype, but it hasn't really changed anybody's actual technology experience on a basic level the way people were discussing. And so I don't know why that is. There may be some technical limitations in the way that things like the blockchain work that just limit its ability to be really used widely. I loved the idea in theory, but I haven't yet seen it play out.